Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey. I'm a CDS fellow. I'm super excited to be talking to you all about my project, which is about the future of authentication and more specifically, passwordless security. So I don't know if when you woke up today, you realized that you're living in the future. The future is now. But before we get to that future, we have to understand kind of the problems that we're solving for with regards to authentication. And so right now, authentication is very reliant on us using our passwords to access our accounts. And everyone here obviously is familiar with passwords, has used passwords to get in. And since they're so prevalent, it's sometimes hard to understand how problematic they can be from a security perspective, as well as from a usage perspective, as being a user authenticating with a password. Some of the issue is that you have to remember your password. They're memory-based, which makes it, people use sticky notes and other insecure methods to help them in remembering passwords. They're not a they're not a great user experience, meaning we're familiar with the flow of putting in your username and a password, but honestly, it isn't a great way to kind of get into a website. They're vulnerable because they're easy to exploit. We all know about phishing attacks, data breaches. A day doesn't go by where there isn't a big headline about a company being affected by this. And then fundamentally, they're insecure. So they can be cracked with brute force methods. And whenever there is a data breach, there's always an accompanying effort, either on the dark web or by nefarious actors, to take the breach data, try to reverse engineer it, and solve for the most common passwords to then try to get access into other user accounts, because people tend to recycle passwords. They tend to reuse the passwords from one service to another, even after they're made aware that their data was breached. Like, that's how big of a problem it is. Here are some metrics to that point. Almost about two-thirds of people admit to reusing passwords. Admit, I'm sure the number is like 90%. Almost 90% of orgs experienced a phishing attack in the last year. 300 million people were impacted by data breaches in 2021, which was the most recent number I was able to get. And 74% of enterprises and orgs experience some level of malware activity. Malware is basically bad software that is meant to intercept sensitive information, including passwords. And so basically, passwords are a problem for the people using them and for the enterprises relying on their security. What do we do given this information? We've built authentication around basically bolstering passwords, but still keeping them at the center. So right now, people rely on password managers such as LastPass, Bitwarden, OnePass. You might be using one. I use Bitwarden. And it's basically a way of managing the various number of passwords you have to use, that if you're following best practices, right, you're using a unique password for each service. But those are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to exploitation. It happened as recently as August 2022. Another way we bolster security is by using multi-factor authentication, which is you have a password, and for example, for your Tuck login, you'll have Duo, which is a push notification which prompts you to say, are you logging in? Yes, and that makes it harder for your data to be accessed by someone who just has the password but doesn't have access to your authenticated Duo device, right? And then there are one-time passwords where you'll log in, you'll get an email saying, hey, here's this code. If it's actually you, put the code in to prove that you have access to this account. But all of these methods, while yes, they're better than standalone passwords, they're still fundamentally, one, a bad user experience, and two, and potentially most crucially, they have a pitiful usage uptake. So MFA, which is probably one of the more convenient ways to bolster security, only has around 2% of all users use some form of MFA. And users is defined as like broad consumers. And even in organizations, right, even in enterprises that have more at stake in terms of proprietary information, things they need to protect, only around 12% of them have some kind of MFA enforcement mechanism where they require their employees or contractors, whoever has access to that information, to enroll in MFA. Here's some more data breach statistics. Headline is, it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of attacks every year exploiting kind of the weaknesses with the password at the center, with that type of authentication. But like I said, the future is here. As I've worked on this report, through my efforts solely, passkeys have, I'm obviously kidding, but passkeys have progressed greatly. But first, let's start about what passkeys are. So passkeys are an alternative to authenticating with passwords. The way they work is you input your username just like you do today, but instead of you putting in your password, you say, I'm going to authenticate with a passkey. What that does is it prompts you to either, if you don't have a passkey yet, you generate one with a device. It can be a smartphone, it can be a laptop, it can be a tablet that has some kind of biometric authentication. So this could be Face ID in iOS. This could be a fingerprint reader. This could also just be a PIN, right? A PIN you use to unlock your phone. And when you attempt to log into a service that supports passkey, when you select the passkey option, it sends a challenge to that device saying, is this you trying to log in? And you say yes. It does a biometric check using Face ID or fingerprint or whatever. And if it succeeds, if it matches, there's an exchange in the end-to-end encrypted, and you're let into your account. And the takeaways here are, there is nothing to remember, right? There's no password that you need to kind of memorize or use a password manager for. The way the authentication works, I won't go in super detail. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer them in the end. But the way the authentication works is it's end-to-end encrypted. A public key is generated on the service. A private key resides solely on your device. And when the device does the biometric check, it tells the service, yes, this is the correct person. And so there's nothing exchanged that can be intercepted by a malicious actor, right? So that eliminates the attack vector of phishing, which is one of the most common ways that people intercept or get a handle on passwords or sensitive information. And what's really exciting, and again, why I keep kind of jokingly but seriously saying that the future is here, is passkeys are pushed and supported by the FIDO Alliance, which is an open industry group that has membership across almost every tech company you've heard of, but crucially by Google, Apple, and Microsoft, who are building in passkey support at an operating system level to all of their platforms. So that means iOS for Apple, including iOS, macOS, iPadOS, all of their devices, Safari on their browser, Google on the Android front, on the Chrome front, and Microsoft on Windows, which is really exciting because it really helps for adoption, which I'll talk about shortly. So you can actually do this. I won't have you do this now because that means you'll stop paying attention to me. But you can go to g.co/passkeys to enroll your Google account into a passkey today. I did it this morning. And you'll see in the first screen, it'll prompt you you go to that address. It'll take you to your Google account. If you don't have a passkey yet, you'll have to log in doing the 21st century method. But you can create a passkey down here, and then that'll prompt you to say, do you want to create a passkey? Continue. You'll click that, and then this is from a flow on a iOS device, so from an iPhone or a Mac, and it's basically saying, do you want to create a passkey for this Gmail account? It'll reside on your iCloud account. You click continue, and then this is what the screen looks like on your Google security page. It'll say automatically created passkeys, and it'll list the iCloud keychain that you just created. And then the next time you log in to your Google service, you can choose, it'll put your username, and it'll have either the password field, or it'll have a little button that says log in using another method. You click that, and there'll be a new passkey option. And all you have to do is click that. It'll send a challenge to your enrolled device. You hit continue. It'll do Face ID, and you're logged in. And you didn't have to put in a password. And that's live now. And it's really cool because I tested it on my iPhone. I tested it on my Windows computer. And so that requires integration between Google, Apple, and Microsoft, all those use cases, and it worked perfectly, which is awesome. So one of the big takeaways for my project was, what is the adoption path, right? We have passkeys as a standard. How do we get from, hey, there's this great new protocol. I want everyone to be using it. I want a safer world, right? So there's kind of 6 steps. This looks like 4. I broke down the fourth step into kind of 3 subparts. It's 6 total. The first step is you have the development of the tech, the development of passkeys, which, like I mentioned, is led by the FIDO Alliance. And this is where the design, building, and testing of the tech just on a concept basis, like does this work, sample level of 1 or 2, like very little. That started 8-9 years ago. Then once you have that concept check, you have the testing and certification where independent respected authority evaluates and certifies the tech. This gives it credibility that's needed for kind of the next steps to start, which is the next step is just education, marketing, promotion, right? You have to make people aware, hey, there's this new tech, this is how it's better, right? These are the use cases, these are the benefits, this is the cost, right? The cost required to adopt it. And then that will start the waterfall of consequences where you have adoption starting at the industry leaders, then early adopters, and then finally general industry and consumers. I inserted this kind of dotted line right under industry leaders because that's where we are. With passkeys, it's been developed, it's been tested, education, marketing, promotion have happened, although that's still ongoing. I guess that's part of what I'm doing here. And then it's been adopted by the industry leaders, mainly those in the FIDO, and it's starting to go out into kind of the early adopters. And hopefully you will all be early adopters, and you can start moving the adoption curve out. And so what have I learned? I had great conversations with a lot of experts in cybersecurity, people from the consumer side, people from the enterprise side, including chief information security officers, like the whole gamut, Dartmouth computer science professors, really interesting people who are very experienced. And these are kind of some of the main takeaways. The first is that education and promotion are tough. This relates to basically educating and promoting a new standard to the public and to industry in order to get them to make that change. This is a great quote from Jim Fenton, who's a consultant to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a government body that basically certifies, they approve like AES encryption and allows like all government agencies to use that, right? Like that kind of thing. He says, passwords have all sorts of problems, but it is what people know and know how to use. Introducing a new alternative is going to be a huge education effort, especially something as intangible as passkeys. And so this is acknowledging how hard that is. And this is something that FIDO and all of the member organizations like Apple, Microsoft, and Google have been working on for about 8 years. They've been pushing this. This is not new. They've been trying to kind of get the word out for a long time. It's now that people can use it with fairly low friction. That goes on to kind of the next point, which is adoption can take a long time. User behavior is deeply entrenched. And then I mentioned there's a huge difference between opt-in versus opt-out. And what this is referring to is you can have a current system that is deeply flawed and very visibly problematic, like we have with password-based authentication, where, again, a day doesn't go by, you don't hear about a huge data breach. But that's still not enough for people to be like, we got to change this, right? People will continue kind of using the same thing over and over and over. And one theme that came across independently in various of the conversations I had was how this difference between opt-in and opt-out, which means like, are passkeys going to be rolled out by Apple, Microsoft, Google, those people or those institutions of the world in a way where people have to use them? Or is it going to be, a system where it'll be a side offering to passwords and you can use them if you want, right? Which would be kind of more opt-in. And, who knows? Right now it's very much opt-in, like they're not going to force you to use it, but I wouldn't be surprised if in, a significant amount of years, there's a cost-benefit analysis that happens and it's like, 80% of the people are already using passkeys, password-based authentication is too much of a risk vector, we're just going to shut it down. But that would be a long time away. So for now, it's entirely opt-in. The third lesson is that convenience is a major key. That's a reference to DJ Khaled, Major Key, if you guys know your memes. But there is a trade-off between security and convenience, and most people will embrace convenience given the option. And that's, I think, one of the killer apps or killer features for passkeys, which is once you enrolling it is pretty painless, like I described. And once you have it, it is super easy to use. It is like very easy to authenticate with passkeys. And so you are marrying this like quantum leap in security with user friendliness that will hopefully mean the adoption will come faster than it otherwise would, right? Currently, there exist alternatives in authentication to passwords, like security keys, like hardware keys. I have one right here, a YubiKey. This is like an encrypted key that you can use to log into certain accounts that support it, and it's like impossible to phish because you have to have the actual physical key. But you need to buy it. You need to like set it up. It's like a pain. So only like 0.5% of the nerds out there like me use that. And then the fourth takeaway is that improvement needs to be huge. It's not enough to have an incremental improvement because user behavior is so entrenched. You need to have a huge improvement. And this is a cool quote from Robert Thelen, an ex-Tucky, alumni Tucky, who founded this startup called Round. Says, traditional authentication is a tax on growth. When we ask customers why they didn't move away from that, it's because they couldn't. That means there's a great opportunity for innovation there. What this is referring to is that, we need authentication to create security and support services we like. But at the end of the day, there's also clearly a friction between building something that's really secure and building something that people want to use. And so Round is one of those startups that is looking at kind of more granular authentication, where instead of like you do one check and then you have the keys to the kingdom, you can use everything in your data, building more incremental checkpoints where it's like you can view certain data if you just put in your email. If you, check it with a one-time code, you can do a little bit more, and then kind of gating access along those lines. And they are also building in support for passkeys, which is exciting. And that's it. Thank you so much for paying attention. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
I have a question about this idea. Can you go back to the lessons learned about the adoption piece when it comes to about companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, sort of opting in?
This one?
Yeah, like just the opt-in versus opt-out
Yeah.
idea, right? Like, given the pain that passwords have, why even? Well, I guess what's the friction of like the whole allowing people to opt in as opposed to opt out, given that we do know the benefits that this has versus the current method, which is people just reuse their passwords being so terrible for everyone. Why even? Like, is there actual friction from a consumer standpoint that don't want sort of the biometrics and sort of the way that the passkey would solve? Like, yeah, from what you know, what you think, why do you think there is sort of that even dilemma between opt-in versus opt-out?
I think it's a great question. I think fundamentally the answer is kind of in the quote Robert Thelen gave, where it's a tax on growth. I think transitioning to a new way of authenticating with passkeys, even as easy as it is, right, relative to other options, there is still going to be user resistance to behavioral change. Like anytime any big web service rolls out even the most minuscule of changes, you have people complaining about how they liked it older, and most of the times they forget and they move on and they keep using it, but there's always that resistance. So I think in the whole opt-in versus opt-out debate, it's more a cost benefit from Google, Apple, Microsoft of the world. They're saying, if we force people to use this, right, like you won't be able to access your Microsoft account if you don't enroll in a passkey, then that's people who might just like fall off, right? So the way they're approaching it right now is they're offering it as an alternative, meaning opt in, you can use it if you want. And I'm hopeful that most people, more and more people will be opting in, and as it reaches critical mass, like I said, maybe it'll reach a point where the amount of people that are not using it are relatively small, but the amount of risk of offering passwords is relatively big. And so the companies are going to be like, you know what? We're going to sunset passwords by 2050. I don't know, whatever year. Oh, I don't know what happened there. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
My impression is that for the passkeys to work, it needs to be linked to like facial recognition or fingerprints, sort of biometric hardware. And I don't know what the penetration of like mobile devices have biometric hardware, but do you see this as a challenge to adoption, especially in maybe like the developing markets?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, but obviously the market share varies by market to market, with more developing and socioeconomically disadvantaged markets having lower adoption, but smartphones are still present, even in one of the, like, I think India has around 60% smartphone penetration, and that's one of the lower penetration markets. In the US, it's like 95%. China is about, I think, 80%. And so all modern smartphones have some form of biometric. But what's nice is passkeys do offer support for just like pins. So you don't actually have to have a biometric check. That is recommended because you can't intercept the biometric check, whereas a pin you could, in theory, kind of fish it or figure out what the pin is and then do it. But when I enrolled my laptop, my Windows computer doesn't support biometrics, right? So I just typed in my PIN that I use to unlock my computer, and it works for passkeys. So I don't think biometric adoption will be a big barrier in terms of having that option available. I do think there may be resistance from some people. I don't think it'll be a minority, but some people who are worried about being so reliant on biometrics just from a privacy perspective, right? They don't want to have that dependency. Again, getting a little bit in the weeds, the biometric info never leaves your device, so it's not like these websites are going to have access to it, but sometimes people don't care and they're kind of freaked out by it.
You mentioned that this is being kind of built into the OS level. Does that mean that the owners of the OS essentially become the managers of authentication across the entire web?
Yeah. So that's a big risk, and I think one consideration I had at the outset of my project, where I asked a lot of the kind of experts I spoke to, like, do you see this as a centralization risk, right? Do you see this where like Apple, Google, Microsoft will have the keys to the kingdom? I was surprised that most of them weren't too worried about it. I think for a few reasons. One, the current paradigm is so flawed that even moving into a more centralized paradigm that is more secure, that there's upside there. I think that's one reason. The other reason is, for now, FIDO's been around for about 15 years. Passkeys promotion has been around almost a decade, a little less. They are approaching this in a pretty open industry way. Anyone can join. I didn't mention the litany of long list of tech companies, but there's Adobe's in it, like DocuSign's in it, like a bunch of prominent companies are in it. So I think it is being rolled out fairly democratically, and I do think, frankly, you need that OS level adoption for there to be a sea change. So I think most people are like, yeah, there's a risk, but the upside makes it worth it.
I had a question regarding just like this for OS. If there was, obviously the incentive right now for them to push it is like security, but then do you see any additional incentives, maybe from a financial or like a business perspective, that will help them sort of push this mandatory passkey situation?
You mean by whom?
For Microsoft, because right now, I mean, the security is the main like sell, right? Is there any additional opportunities for these big companies to like really push passkey?
I mean, I'm not sure. I think there's big savings in terms of like economic impact from data breaches and whatnot that they can push. Are you meaning like for them to monetize passkeys? I don't know. I think that would be hard because they're building it using an open standard. I don't think, as far as I know, there's no like closed source IP that Microsoft owns or that Google owns or that Apple owns that they could use to carve out their territory. And frankly, I think it's in their advantage to make it so everyone, it's interoperability is a big incentive, right? Apple wants Microsoft to use it because Apple users are more secure on it. And just, once you have a critical mass of users, that's when it happens. I don't really see a big way for them to monetize this. And I think that's a good thing. I think making it so it's an open standard, there's no royalties, you don't have to pay a subscription, right, to log in with passkeys. Who knows, they're like wild ideas that sometimes make it too far before they're killed in a company. But I don't see that as a big risk. Yeah, I'm
Just a clarification question on the rollout. So for example, you mentioned Google Passkey, and like anyone can get it.
You can get it right now.
Yeah, and it's like open industry as well, I think overall. I'm just curious to see, like, from what you see with like Google Passkey and others, like, are they trying to gain traction within company environments, or is it more like at the consumer level, like, you come across this, you download it, or is there an opportunity to come and go within companies that are interested in adopting something like this, and if so, have they gained any traction, or do they have plans to do that?
To clarify, do you mean Google adopting it amongst its own Google employees, or you mean Google targeting enterprises? Okay. Yeah, no, I think a lot of the education's happening on a multifaceted level. I think there's like very consumer-friendly education about like how Joe, from Main Street can use it to protect their like Facebook account and their, Yelp account. But there's also an enterprise level, like this is how you can have a data architecture that like accepts passkeys. Like, these are your devices. You have like a Windows stack, you have a Mac stack, you have an iOS stack. Like this is how you can enroll it. This is how you can set permissions. And I know in Google's case, in its Google Workplaces accounts, those, I don't think you can create an enforcement standard yet, but it's coming, where you can require your workplace, like everyone has to have a passkey, right? That's not quite here yet, but it is coming soon. I just showed the flow for enrolling in Google, but like Apple supports passkeys and Microsoft does too. Google just came out with a big wave of PR like a week ago announcing it. That's why I chose them.
I do have a question also. So does this make companies like Duo obsolete in the future? And if you were working at Duo, how would you view passkeys?
It's a good question. I think I would view them as a threat, but I think I would also realize that, again, user behavior change takes a while, and it may be easier to pitch a company on, a Duo. If I have a great go-to-market plan for a university like Dartmouth or for an enterprise, I may be able to say, hey, in the interim, like use Duo before, you can support passkeys. I do think there may be companies that their current business model, their current value add is like impacted by this. But I do also see companies that like password managers, which are back here, LastPass, Bitwarden, and OnePass all announced that they're going to be supporting passkeys, where you can store them. Instead of storing a password, you basically store a passkey in the cloud with their cloud, and you use that to log in, from kind of a centralized account. So I do think there's ways to incorporate passkeys into current authentication options, but some may have to kind of completely rethink their model.
Maybe last, I think, so generally the test of security comes at the industry vertical side in terms of adoption. So do you see like financial institutions and stuff like that then going after the adoption and making this as an option for like bank accounts and stuff like that? Are they because that's where you maybe see adoption for the first time?
It's funny you asked that, because I asked this to a bunch of the experts I spoke to. I asked, hey, do you see this as more valuable for those types of accounts, like where the money is, right, where people are really worried about security? And they said, yes, there's a lot of value there, but those are the types of firms or enterprises that are very, very slow on adoption. Like they are definitely not industry leaders, well, as it conforms to this authentication, and they're definitely not early adopters, and they're probably like step 4 here, where it's not general industry, it's like the laggards, right? Like the people who are super late. I think there's an irony there, because I think they have the most to gain potentially from more security, but there's all sorts of, I think, regulatory requirements where certain firms can't require a standard until it's certified by certain government bodies if they want to be eligible for like, certain insurance like FDIC and whatever. So I think that is a potential challenge, but I do think that you can have, I think I have a quote here, where it says, Adam Goldner said, once people start using passkey authentication with their phone on personal devices, they want to do it at their work. I think this extends to once people start using it for their Google account, their Apple account, whatever, they're going to think, why isn't my bank supporting this? You know what I mean? And there may be consumer pressure onto the banks to adopt this. And at that point, I think you would see adoption. But I would suspect, unfortunately, banks and those kind of financial institutions that are more conservative to have a later adoption.
So for example, if my bank app right now uses Face ID, would that sort of fall into a passkey adoption already?
It's a different authentication. Yeah, that's not passkey tech. That's using a biometric check. And there are parallels, but for that to work, they would have to kind of embrace. There would be some back-end changes they would have to make in terms of their tech stack. Great. All right. Thank you very much.